The wind was a thief in this part of the country. It stole the moisture from the earth, leaving behind a puzzle of cracked mud where rivers once ran. It stole the warmth from a man's bones in the winter and the breath from his lungs in the summer. It stripped the land down to its skeleton of rock and dust, and it did the same to the people who dared to live there. Cole Mercer's ranch was a testament to this truth. It huddled near the Wyoming border, a solitary outpost against the vast, indifferent plains. The cabin was small, built of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud that was forever crumbling. The barn leaned as if tired of fighting the relentless push of the sky. His cattle were thin, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their hides as they clustered near the dry creek bed, their lowing a mournful complaint against the parched land. Each day was a quiet battle, and most days, the land won. Cole moved through his chores with a grim, practiced economy. There were no wasted motions, no idle thoughts spoken aloud. Silence was his companion, his penance. He mended fences with the same methodical focus he used to patch his own worn-out shirt, his hands calloused and sure. His face was a map of the landscape, weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the endless horizon. He was a man who had been carved down to his essentials, and what was left was hard and quiet. This solitude was a choice, a hair shirt he wore every day. 5 years. 5 years since the raid, 5 years since the screams had echoed in the night and the smell of smoke had choked the dawn. 5 years since he had found Sarah, his fiancée, in the ruin of what was supposed to have been their home. He had been away, chasing down a stray bull, and had returned too late. He had failed to protect her. The guilt was a stone he carried in his gut, a constant, heavy presence that shaped every sunrise and shadowed every sunset. He had built this small, struggling ranch as his own private prison, a place where he could work until exhaustion silenced the voices in his head. On a late afternoon in August, the sky began to brood. The usual pale blue deepened to a bruised purple along the western edge of the world. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange, electric stillness. The cattle grew restless, their tails twitching as they huddled together, sensing the coming violence. A storm was rolling in, not a gentle summer rain, but one of the furious, dust-choked tempests that could tear a roof from a barn and blind a man in his own yard. Cole knew he was low on salt and coffee, and the thought of being trapped for days with nothing but jerky and his own thoughts was unbearable. He saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Rusty, and cast a final look at the darkening sky. He had a few hours, maybe less. He urged Rusty into a steady trot, heading for the small, dusty settlement that passed for a town. The town was little more than a single dirt street lined with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of other weary-looking buildings. As Cole tied Rusty to the hitching post outside the mercantile, he could feel the eyes on him. He was a known quantity here, the quiet man who kept to himself, who bought his supplies and left without a word of gossip. They respected his privacy because they mistook it for strength. Not understanding it was built on a foundation of profound failure. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of kerosene, leather, and chewing tobacco. 2 men, ranchers from a spread to the south, were leaning against the counter, talking to the proprietor, Mr. Abernathy. Just vanished, they say. One of the men, a heavy-set fellow named Jed, was saying, "Stage driver said she slipped off while they were watering the horses at Willow Creek. Left her trunk and everything." "What's a woman like that doing out here alone anyway?" the other man asked, spitting a stream of brown juice into a nearby spittoon. Mr. Abernathy, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, polished a jar with a rag. "Her husband came through yesterday, asking after her. A Mr. Duval, a fancy man from back east, by the looks of him, flashing a wallet full of money and a temper like a cornered snake." Jed grunted. "Heard she was marked up some bruises on her face. The driver said she looked like a spooked doe, ready to bolt at any shadow." Cole kept his back to them. gathering his supplies. A sack of flour, coffee beans, a block of salt. He tried not to listen. A woman's trouble was not his own. He had learned that lesson in the cruelest way possible. Bringing trouble home was like inviting a wolf into your cabin. Sooner or later, it would turn on you. Duval's offering a reward, Jed continued. His voice lowered conspiratorially. $50 for anyone who finds her. Says she's his wife and he has a right to her. Sheriff told him the same. A man's got a right to his property. The words settled in the dusty air, ugly and final. Cole paid for his goods, his face an unreadable mask. He nodded once to Mr. Abernathy and walked out, the men's low laughter following him into the street. The wind was stronger now, whipping dust into his eyes and pulling at the brim of his hat. He loaded his supplies, untied Rusty, and swung into the saddle, eager to be gone, to return to the familiar quiet of his ranch. The ride home was a race against the storm. The sky was now a churning cauldron of black and gray clouds. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dry ground with sizzling sounds, raising the scent of dust and ozone. The world seemed to shrink, the vast plains disappearing behind a curtain of approaching rain. It was the flash of color that caught his eye, a smudge of pale blue against the dun-colored earth. Just off the trail, near a cluster of sagebrush, it was out of place. Nothing grew in that color out here. Cole reined Rusty in, his curiosity warring with his instinct to keep riding. He hesitated, his hand resting on the pommel of his saddle. It was probably nothing, a discarded piece of cloth, a trick of the fading light. He nudged Rusty off the trail, his boots crunching on the dry gravel. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman. She was lying face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that was not there. Her dress, the pale blue he had seen, was torn at the shoulder and hemmed with dirt and grime. Cole dismounted, his movements slow and cautious. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her still form. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. There was no response. He gently reached out and touched her shoulder. She was thin, almost bird-like, but she was warm. He carefully turned her over. Her face was a mess. A fresh, ugly bruise was darkening along her jawline, and her lip was split and swollen. Fainter, yellowish marks shadowed her cheekbone, the ghosts of older injuries. She was young, younger than he had expected, with a cascade of dark hair tangled with bits of leaf and dirt. Even in her unconscious state, with her face marred and dirty, there was a delicacy to her features that seemed alien to this harsh land. He stood up, his jaw tight. This was her, the runaway wife. Jed's words echoed in his mind. A man's got a right to his property. He should get back on his horse. He should ride to the sheriff and report what he had found. Let the law handle it. Let her husband come and claim her. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. He looked down at her again, at the way her chest rose and fell in a shallow, uneven rhythm. He saw the faint, white line of an old scar just above her collarbone, peeking out from the torn fabric of her dress. And in that moment, he saw Sarah. He saw the vulnerability, the helplessness, the silent plea for a protection he had failed to provide. The stone of guilt in his gut shifted, grinding against his insides. He swore under his breath, a low, harsh sound that was swallowed by the wind. He could not leave her here. He could not leave her for the wolves or for the man who had put those marks on her face. It did not matter what trouble she brought. Leaving her would be a betrayal of a ghost he could never appease. With a sigh that seemed to pull up from the soles of his boots, he bent down. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She was lighter than he expected, as if she were hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. He carried her to his horse and carefully maneuvered her into the saddle, settling her in front of him. She slumped against his chest, her head lolling onto his shoulder, a dead weight of trouble and sorrow. As he urged Rusty toward home, the storm finally broke, and the rain came down in a cold, driving sheet. Clara awoke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. For a disoriented moment, she did not know where she was. The ceiling above her was made of rough, dark logs. The bed beneath her was a narrow cot with a coarse wool blanket. A fire crackled in a stone hearth across the small room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was not the frilly, suffocating bedroom of her husband's house. It was not the cold, damp earth of the barn. Then she saw him. A man was standing with his back to her, tending to a pot over the fire. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his form a dark silhouette against the flames. A jolt of pure, animal terror shot through her. Edwin. He had found her. The breath caught in her throat, a strangled, silent scream. She scrambled backward on the cot, her body moving before her mind could catch up. The movement was clumsy, desperate. She knocked over a small wooden crate next to the bed, sending a tin cup clattering to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. The man spun around. It was not Edwin. This man's face was harder, carved from the land itself. His eyes were a startlingly pale gray, and they watched her with a guarded stillness. He had a beard, neatly trimmed but thick, and his dark hair was shaggy around his collar. He made no move toward her. He simply stood and watched as she pressed herself into the corner of the wall, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin like a shield. "Easy now," he said. His voice was low and deep, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floor. He held up his hands, palms out, showing they were empty. "You're safe." The word was meaningless to her. She had not been safe in years. She shook her head, a small, convulsive movement. Her throat was raw, and when she tried to speak, only a hoarse whisper came out. "Who are you? Where am I?" "Name's Cole Mercer. This is my place. I found you out on the stagecoach trail. You'd collapsed." He took a half step back, deliberately increasing the distance between them. "The storm was coming in. I couldn't just leave you there." Her eyes darted around the cabin. It was a simple, one-room dwelling, starkly masculine. A rifle rested on pegs above the door. A saddle was slung over a wooden horse in the corner. There was nowhere to run. She was trapped. Again. "Please," she whispered, the word tearing at her throat. "Please do not hurt me." A flicker of something, pain, anger, he could not be sure, crossed his face. It was there and gone in an instant. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice flat. He gestured with his head toward the fire. "I made some coffee, and there's stew, if you're hungry." Mistrust was a bitter taste in her mouth. Kindness was a currency she could no longer afford to believe in. It was always a trick, a prelude to something worse. Edwin had been kind at first, too. He had wooed her with gentle words and promises, and she had believed him. A foolish girl swept away by a handsome face and a full wallet. The gentleness had not lasted. Cole saw the suspicion in her eyes. He understood it. He poured himself a cup of coffee and took a long drink. He ladled some of the thick beef stew into a bowl and sat down at the small, rough-hewn table, eating slowly, deliberately. He did not look at her, giving her space to breathe, to think. After a long time, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach won out over her fear. She slowly, cautiously, swung her legs off the cot. Every muscle in her body ached. She stood on shaky legs and padded over to the hearth. He had left a bowl and a spoon for her. With trembling hands, she filled the bowl with stew. She did not sit at the table with him but returned to the cot, perching on the edge like a frightened bird ready to take flight at the slightest provocation. She ate in silence, ravenously. The stew was hot and rich, and it sent a welcome warmth spreading through her chilled body. She had not realized how hungry she was. She had been running for 2 days, fueled by nothing but fear and stale bread she had stolen from Edwin's kitchen. When she was finished, She set the empty bowl aside. The man, Cole, was still at the table, nursing his coffee, watching the rain lash against the single grimy window pane. "The storm should pass by morning," he said, his gaze still fixed on the window. "You can have the cot for the night. I'll take the chair. In the morning, you'll need to be on your way." He finally turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes direct and unflinching. "I don't want any trouble here, ma'am. I'm guessing you've got a whole storm of it following you, and my roof is not strong enough to stand up to it." His words were blunt, but there was no malice in them. It was a simple statement of fact. He was offering her shelter, a temporary reprieve, and nothing more. She should have been grateful, but all she felt was a fresh wave of despair. On her way to where? She had nowhere to go. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Her name felt like a link to a life she was desperate to escape, but she owed him that much. "Clara," she said softly. "Clara Duval." He nodded, his face giving nothing away. He had heard the name in town. He knew who her husband was. He knew there was a reward, but he said none of this. He simply stood, took his empty bowl to the washing basin, and began to clean up. The silence that fell between them was heavier now, thick with all the questions he did not ask and all the answers she would not give. Her story was a secret she held tight in her chest, a venomous snake that she dared not release. To speak of it would be to give it life, to make it real again. The bruises on her skin were testament enough. As night deepened, the storm raged outside. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin like a hungry animal, and the rain beat a frantic tattoo on the sod roof. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the ticking of a small, cheap clock on the mantelpiece. The sounds from the world outside seemed to magnify the tension within. Clara lay on the cot, pulling the blanket up to her ears, but she could not block out the noise. Every creak of the floorboards as Cole moved about the small space made her flinch. Every time a log shifted in the fireplace and sent a shower of sparks up the chimney, her heart leaped into her throat. She lay perfectly still, feigning sleep, but her body was a rigid knot of terror. Cole had given her a clean, worn shirt of his to sleep in, and she had changed in the small space he had afforded her by turning his back. The rough cotton was a strange comfort against her skin, smelling faintly of soap and the outdoors. It was so different from the lace and silk Edwin had forced her to wear, garments that felt more like a cage than clothing. Across the room, Cole sat in a rocking chair by the fire, a rifle resting across his lap. He had not said why he kept the weapon so close, but she knew it was for her, or for what might come looking for her. He stared into the flames, his face grim, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. He could not sleep. The image of her bruised face was seared into his mind, tangled up with the ghosts of his own past. He had brought the trouble in, and now he had to sit watch over it. From the darkness of the plains, a new sound arose, weaving its way through the howl of the wind. It was a long, mournful cry, rising and falling with a chilling cadence. Wolves. The sound was wild and lonely, a perfect echo of the desolation that surrounded them, and the fear that trapped them together in the small, firelit cabin. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a single, hot tear escaping and tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Outside, the wolves howled. Inside, two strangers sat in the dark, each imprisoned by a pain they could not name. The morning after the storm, the world was washed clean. The air, scrubbed of dust, was sharp and cool, and the rising sun cast long, clear shadows across the damp earth. Cole had said she must be on her way, but when he saw her standing by the door, a small, lost figure against the vastness of the plains, the words caught in his throat. The bruise on her jaw had deepened to a vicious purple, and her eyes were wide with an exhaustion that went bone deep. Sending her out into this wilderness was no different from leaving her for the wolves. "The creek's running high," he said, his voice a low growl. "You'll not get across for a day or two." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. He turned away before she could answer, grabbing his axe and heading for a fallen cottonwood the storm had brought down. And so, one day bled into the next. An unspoken truce settled over the small cabin. Clara did not speak of leaving, and Cole did not press her. A silent routine took root. A delicate dance of two solitary people confined in a space too small for secrets. She rose before him, rekindling the fire and putting coffee on to boil. She found a quiet purpose in the simple domestic tasks he had long neglected. She scrubbed the cabin's floorboards until the wood gleamed, patched the elbows of his worn flannel shirts with neat, tiny stitches, and cooked meals that were more than just fuel for a working man. She made biscuits that were light and fluffy, and her stews had a richness that his own bachelor efforts had always lacked. She was trying to repay him, to earn her keep. Her work was a currency she offered in place of the story she could not bring herself to tell. Each mended seam, each swept corner, was a word in a conversation they were not having. For Cole, her presence was a constant, low-grade disturbance, like a stone in his boot. He was accustomed to the stark emptiness of his home, to the silence that was filled only by the wind and his own grim thoughts. Now, there was the soft rustle of her dress, the quiet hum of a tune she sometimes sang under her breath, the scent of baking bread that clung to the log walls. He fought it. He kept his distance, making his world the barn, the fences, and the endless horizon. He spoke to her only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. Need more wood. Flour sacks near empty. Watch for rattlers by the creek. He would watch her from the corner of his eye as she worked, her movements deft and graceful despite the weariness that clung to her. He saw the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair when she stepped outside to shake out a blanket. He noticed the strength in her slender hands as she kneaded dough. An attraction, unwanted and deeply unsettling, began to stir within him. It felt like a betrayal of Sarah, whose memory was the bedrock of his self-imposed exile, and a betrayal of this woman, who was broken and running from a man who had claimed her with his fists. He was no better than her husband if he looked at her and felt the pull of desire, so he turned his anger inward, becoming harder, quieter, more remote. About a week after her arrival, the flour sack was finally empty, and the coffee tin held only a few beans. A trip to town could not be avoided. He announced it at breakfast, not looking at her. "I'm riding in for supplies." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a familiar flicker of fear. "He will be there," she whispered. "He will be asking for me." "You'll stay here. Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone." He said it not as a suggestion, but as an order. He saw her flinch at his tone and hated himself for it. He was trying to protect her, but it came out sounding like the very thing she had run from. The ride to town was tense. Every rider he saw in the distance could be her husband, Edwin Duval. The town felt different this time. As he hitched Rusty to the post, he could feel the weight of eyes on his back. The whispers started before he even stepped into the mercantile. In the saloon, where he stopped for a single, quick whiskey to fortify himself, the talk was louder. "That's him, Mercer," a man named Silas muttered to his neighbor, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Heard he's got that runaway woman holed up at his place." The other man snickered. "Keeping her warm through the nights, I reckon. Can't blame him. A man gets lonely out there." Cole's hand tightened around his glass. He kept his eyes fixed on the murky liquid, his jaw a hard line of stone. The crude laughter, the leering suggestions, they made his stomach turn. They were painting him with the same brush as her husband, assuming his motives were just as base, just as possessive. They saw a woman not as a person in trouble, but as a prize to be claimed, a body to be used. The rage that simmered inside him, the quiet, banked fire of his guilt, flared hot and dangerous. He finished his drink in one swallow, slammed the glass on the bar, and walked out without a word. the saloon falling silent in his wake. He bought his supplies from Mr. Abernathy, who had the decency to keep his eyes down and his mouth shut, though even he seemed to bustle with a nervous energy. As Cole was loading the flour and salt onto Rusty, Sheriff Miller approached him. The sheriff was a portly man whose authority came more from the badge pinned to his chest than from any force of character. "Cole," he said, stopping a few feet away and hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Folks are talking." "Folks always are," Cole replied, not pausing in his work. "They're saying you're harboring a runaway, a Mrs. Duval." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Her husband has been through here. He's a man of some means, and he's not happy. Says you've stolen his wife." "I haven't stolen anything," Cole said, his voice level and cold. "I found a woman half dead on the trail and gave her shelter from a storm. Nothing more." "Be that as it may," the sheriff said, shifting his weight. "The law's clear. She's his wife, his property. He's got a right to take her back. He's offering a handsome reward, and he's got a few hard-looking men with him to help in his search. I'd advise you not to get in his way. It won't end well for you." The threat was plain. The law would not protect Clara. It would deliver her back to her tormentor. Cole finished securing his supplies, his movements tight with contained fury. "I'll keep that in mind. Sheriff?" He swung into the saddle and rode out of town, the stares of the townsfolk feeling like brands on his skin. He rode hard, the anger churning inside him. He was angry at the gossips, at the indifferent sheriff, at the man named Duval who had turned a woman into a hunted animal. But most of all, he was angry at himself for being caught in this trap, for letting his conscience overrule his common sense. When he arrived back at the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and red. He saw her before she saw him. She was standing near the edge of the small bluff that overlooked the creek, her arms wrapped around herself as if to keep from flying apart. She was staring east, toward the horizon, a slim, solitary figure poised between the dying light and the encroaching darkness. She looked as if she were waiting, not for a person, but for a judgment, for the inevitable arrival of the past she could not outrun. He dismounted and walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the dusty ground. He stopped a few feet behind her. "You should be inside," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She started, turning to face him. Her face was pale in the twilight, her eyes like dark pools of sorrow. "I saw you coming," she said. "I thought, for a moment, it might be him." They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. The loneliness of the place seemed to press in on them, a physical weight. "He's in town," Cole said finally. "The sheriff told me. He's looking for you." She closed her eyes, a small, pained expression on her face. "I know," she breathed. "He will not stop until he finds me." "Why?" Cole asked, the question escaping him before he could stop it. "Why is he so determined?" Clara looked back toward the horizon, her gaze distant. "Because I am his," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Because he bought me from my father, who had gambling debts. Because a piece of paper in a church says he owns me, and because he cannot stand for something that is his to defy him." The story began to spill out of her then, not in a rush, but in a slow, halting trickle, as if each word were a painful stone she had to dredge up from the bottom of a deep, dark well. "He was charming at first," she began, her voice barely audible. "He brought me gifts, silks and perfumes from cities I had only read about. He told me I was beautiful. I was 16. I believed him." Her mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "The charm did not last. The first time he hit me, he cried afterward. He begged my forgiveness. He said it was because he loved me so much, and the thought of another man looking at me drove him mad." Cole stood frozen, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples. "He started accusing me of things," she continued, her voice trembling now. "If I smiled at the clerk in the store, I was being unfaithful. If I spoke to a neighbor over the fence, I was inviting them into my bed. The accusations became an excuse. He would drink, and then he would correct me." She hugged herself tighter, her knuckles white. "He liked to lock me in the barn, sometimes for a whole day, sometimes longer, with no food and only a bucket of water, to give me time to think about my sins." A low, guttural sound rose in Cole's throat. He choked it back. His rage was a living thing, a wild beast clawing at the inside of his chest, demanding release. He wanted to ride back into town and find this man, this Edwin Duval, and tear him apart with his bare hands. But he stood his ground, silent and rigid, knowing that any movement might shatter the fragile trust she was placing in him. "2 nights ago," she whispered. "He came home from the saloon. He had lost a great deal of money at cards. He said it was my fault, that my wickedness had brought him bad luck. He was worse than ever before." She could not bring herself to say more, but Cole could see it in the haunted depths of her eyes, in the way her body shuddered with the memory. "He finally passed out from the whiskey. I knew if I stayed, I would not survive the morning. So I took what little money I had hidden and I ran. I just ran." She fell silent. The last of the light had faded from the sky, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the vast, velvet darkness. She was looking at him now, her eyes searching his face in the gloom. What she saw there seemed to frighten her more than the memories she had just shared. His face was a mask of granite, but his stillness was terrible. It was the stillness of a coiled snake, of a thundercloud just before the lightning strikes. She could feel the violence radiating from him, a dark, controlled power that was terrifying in its intensity. It felt familiar. It felt like the other side of the same coin as Edwin's explosive rage. "You have that same darkness inside you," she said, her voice a breath of sound. "I can see it." The observation struck him like a physical blow. He said nothing. He could not deny it. He had spent 5 years trying to bury that part of himself. But it was still there, a monster sleeping just beneath the surface. That night, the sky broke open again. A summer storm, more violent than the last, rolled through the valley. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the little cabin to its foundations. Lightning bleached the world white for a split second, followed by an immediate, deafening roar. Cole was sitting by the dying fire when he heard her cry out. It was not a word, but a raw, terrified scream that was ripped from the depths of a nightmare. He was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room to her cot. In the flickering firelight, he could see her thrashing, her hands batting at an unseen enemy, her face contorted in terror. "No," she whimpered, her voice thick with sleep and fear. "Please, Edwin, no more." His name was a curse on her lips. Without thinking, Cole reached down and grasped her shoulders, giving her a gentle shake. "Clara," he said, his voice firm. "Wake up, you're dreaming." Her eyes flew open, but they were wide and unseeing, still trapped in the horror of her dream. She saw his large frame looming over her in the darkness, felt his strong hands on her shoulders, and her terror escalated into pure panic. She began to fight him, her fists striking his chest with surprising force. "Get away from me!" she shrieked. "Do not touch me!" "Clara, it's me. It's Cole." He held her firmly, trying to stop her from hurting herself. "You're safe. It was just a dream." Slowly, recognition began to dawn in her eyes. The cabin, the fire, his face. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a wave of shuddering sobs. She collapsed against him, her body trembling uncontrollably. His arms went around her, pulling her into a sitting position, holding her against his chest. He held her as he would a frightened animal. His touch meant to be steady, reassuring. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs, the warmth of her tears soaking through his shirt. He murmured quiet, meaningless words of comfort, his hand stroking her tangled hair. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the muscles of his back. For a long moment, she allowed herself to take comfort in his strength, in the solid wall of his body shielding her from the storm within and without. But then, as he shifted his hold, his grip on her arm tightened instinctively. It was not a rough gesture, not an angry one, but it was firm. It was the grip of a man, strong and unyielding. She stiffened in his arms. The line between comfort and danger, between a protective embrace and a possessive one, was razor thin. It was a line she had lived on for years. "Please," she gasped, her voice choked with a new kind of fear, a fear of him. "Your hands, please, do not hold me so roughly." Her words hit him like a bucket of ice water. He froze. Roughly. He looked down at his own hands, large and calloused, holding her fragile arms. In his mind, he saw not comfort, but capture. He saw the same possessive force that Edwin Duval claimed as his right, the attraction he had been fighting, the dark anger he had felt earlier. It all coalesced into a single, terrifying impulse. He was holding this broken, beautiful woman in his arms, and he wanted her. The realization filled him with a profound self-loathing. He pulled away from her as if he had been burned. He scrambled to his feet and backed away toward the hearth, putting the width of the room between them. He stood with his back to her, his hands braced on the stone mantelpiece, his head bowed. He was shaken to his core, not by her fear, but by his own. He was no better than the men in the saloon, no better than her husband. He was a man, and the same darkness she saw in him was roaring in his ears. Clara sat huddled on the cot, watching him, her sobs subsiding into quiet, ragged breaths. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small again. The moment of connection was shattered, replaced by a chasm of fear and shame. Outside, the rain beat a relentless, lonely rhythm against the roof, a haunting echo of the solitude that had once again fallen between them, deeper and more terrifying than before. The storm left behind a world of wreckage and mud. Dawn broke on a landscape that looked as if a malevolent giant had passed through, kicking and tearing at the land for sport. The creek, which had been a dry, stony scar on the earth, was now a roaring, muddy torrent. A large section of the corral fence had been obliterated. The posts snapped like twigs. The rails scattered across the pasture. Worst of all, the wind had peeled back a portion of the barn's roof, leaving the hayloft exposed to the elements. Cole surveyed the damage with a grim set to his jaw, the pale morning light doing little to soften the devastation. It was a week's worth of back-breaking work he would have to do alone. He turned to go back inside for a bitter cup of coffee before starting, and found Clara standing in the doorway. She was holding 2 tin mugs of steaming coffee, her face pale but her eyes resolute. "I can help," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a question. He wanted to refuse, to send her back inside where it was warm and dry. He wanted to keep her separate from the hardship of his life, from the mud and the sweat and the pain. But he saw the look in her eyes, a deep-seated need to be useful, to be more than a burden, to fight back against the chaos that had defined her life. To deny her that would be its own kind of cruelty. He took one of the mugs from her, his fingers brushing against hers. The brief touch was like a spark in the cold air. "All right," he grunted, "but it's hard work." "I am not afraid of work," she replied, and for the first time, he heard a note of pride in her voice, a flicker of the person she might have been before she became a victim. The work was brutal. The ground was a thick, sucking quagmire that pulled at their boots with every step. The air was cold and damp. The sky a uniform sheet of gray that promised more rain. They started with the fence, their first task a miserable one. Hauling the broken posts out of the mud. The waterlogged wood was heavy, and the slick mud offered no firm footing. They worked in a silence born of exertion, their breathing coming in ragged puffs of white in the chill air. He showed her how to use a post hole digger, his large hands guiding hers on the worn wooden handles. He was acutely aware of her closeness, of the scent of rain in her hair, of the delicate strength in her small frame. He tried to maintain a professional distance, to be the stern taskmaster. But the shared struggle began to break down the walls between them. Late in the afternoon, as they were wrestling a new, heavy corner post into place, Clara's boot slipped in the mud. She cried out, stumbling backward. Cole reacted without thinking, dropping his end of the post and lunging to catch her. He grabbed her arm, steadying her, his other hand landing on her waist. The post they had been holding toppled over with a great splash, splattering them both from head to toe in thick, brown mud. For a moment, they just stood there, frozen. He was holding her, her body pressed against his, the mud a cold shock against their skin. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. Then she looked down at the fallen post, at the fresh coat of mud covering her dress, at the comical splatter across his face. A small sound escaped her lips, half a gasp, half a chuckle, and then she laughed. It was not a loud laugh, but a soft, fragile sound, rusty from disuse. It was like hearing a bird sing after a long, hard winter. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place in their grim world, that Cole felt a smile tug at his own lips. A real smile, the first in years. He let out a low chuckle in response. The shared laughter hung in the air between them for a precious second, a small, warm bubble in the cold, gray day. It was the most intimate thing they had yet shared. The moment passed. He released her, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second too long at her waist before he dropped it. They looked at each other, the laughter gone, replaced by a sudden, profound awareness. They turned back to the fallen post, their cheeks flushed, the air between them now charged with a new and unspoken tension. In the days that followed, the delicate fabric of their connection was woven from 1,000 such small moments. The wall of silence between them did not vanish, but it became thinner, more permeable. They began to talk, not of their pasts, but of the present. They talked about the weather, about a hawk they saw circling high overhead, about the stubbornness of a particular calf. These small, safe conversations were like bridges built across a deep and dangerous canyon. The intimacy grew in the spaces between words. It was in the way she would leave a plate of warm biscuits on the table for him when he came in late from the fields. It was in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh, clean water for her by the cabin door each morning. He found himself watching her, noticing things he had no right to notice. He saw the way she would bite her lip in concentration when she was mending a tear in his shirt, the way she would brush a stray lock of dark hair from her forehead with the back of her hand when she was flushed from the heat of the cook stove. His gaze would linger on the graceful curve of her neck, on the determined set of her jaw, and he would have to force himself to look away, a familiar shame coiling in his gut. She, too, watched him. She saw the deep weariness in his eyes at the end of the day, the loneliness etched into the lines of his face. She noticed the surprising gentleness in his calloused hands when he was treating a sick animal. One evening, she saw him standing by the graves of his parents, his hat in his hands, his head bowed against the setting sun. He thought he was alone, but she saw his solitary grief, and her heart ached with a compassion that was dangerously close to something more, their shared space. Once a battlefield of mistrust was becoming a sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary with a ticking clock, and the outside world was not going to leave them in peace. The townsfolk began to turn on him in earnest. When he rode in for nails to finish the barn roof, the whispers were no longer behind his back. They were a low, hostile hum that followed him down the street. Men who had once nodded a grudging respect now turned their faces away or stared at him with open contempt. At the blacksmith's shop, the smith's son, a lanky youth with a cruel mouth, deliberately spat a wad of tobacco near Cole's boots. Cole's hand twitched toward the pistol on his hip, but he forced himself to stay calm, to ignore the provocation. He was a pariah, a man hiding a fugitive, a man who had stolen another man's property. He tried to shield Clara from it, but their supplies were running low again. He put off the trip for as long as he could, but finally, they were out of flour and sugar. He told her he would go, but she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it. "I have been hiding long enough. I cannot be a prisoner here. I will go." He argued with her, his voice low and urgent. "You do not know what they are saying. Clara, it is not safe." "And what will they do to me in the middle of the day? In the general store?" she countered, her chin held high. "Spit cruel words at me? I have had worse. I need to do this. Cole, for myself." He saw the iron resolve in her eyes and knew he could not stop her without physically restraining her. And that was a line he would never cross. He relented, his heart a cold knot of dread in his chest. He watched her ride away on his gentlest mare, her back straight, a small, defiant figure heading toward a town that was ready to devour her. The moment Clara entered Abernathy's mercantile, a hush fell over the store. 3 women who had been chatting by the bolt goods counter stopped mid-sentence, their eyes fixing on her with a predatory stillness. Clara ignored them, her gaze fixed on the counter as she walked forward, her steps measured and even. She could feel their stares on her like insects crawling on her skin. She gave her list to Mr. Abernathy, who avoided her eyes, his hands fumbling as he gathered her items. It was then that the women began to talk again, their voices pitched just loud enough to be clearly overheard. "That's her," one of them, the preacher's wife, said, her voice dripping with pious venom. "The one staying out at the Mercer place. Shameless." "I heard her husband is a wealthy man," the second woman added. "She must have done something awful for him to be hunting her like this. Probably ran off with another man and got herself tossed aside." "She will ruin Cole Mercer," the first woman declared, her voice rising with self-righteous certainty. "He was a good man, if a bit strange, kept to himself. But she will ruin him, same way she ruined her husband. Trouble follows that kind of woman. She's tainted goods." The words were like stones, each one striking Clara with a physical force. Tainted goods. Ruined. She stood rigid, her hands clenched at her sides, her face a pale mask. She paid Mr. Abernathy, her hands trembling so badly she could barely count the coins. She did not look at the women as she took her sack of flour and walked out of the store, their smug, satisfied faces burning in her mind's eye. She held her composure until she was well out of town, until the last building had disappeared behind her. Then, the dam of her control broke. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, and then another. She could not breathe. The world was tilting, the cruel words echoing in her head. She pulled the mare to a stop by the riverbank, slid from the saddle, and collapsed onto the damp ground, her body shaking with a grief so profound it felt like it was tearing her apart. Cole had been unable to settle. He had paced the length of the cabin a dozen times, his gut churning with anxiety. When she had been gone for 2 hours, he could stand it no longer. He saddled Rusty and rode out to meet her. He found her horse grazing peacefully by the side of the trail. And then he saw her, a small, crumpled heap by the water's edge, her shoulders shaking. He dismounted and approached her slowly, his heart aching at the sight of her raw, unconsolable sorrow. He knelt in the dirt beside her, not touching her, just letting his presence be known. She looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "They hate me," she choked out. They said I was tainted, that I will ruin you." He looked at her, at the raw pain in her eyes, and the fury he felt toward the town, toward her husband, toward the whole unjust world, was a white-hot fire. But his voice, when he spoke, was quiet and rough with an emotion she could not name. "Do not listen to them," he said, his gaze holding hers. He reached out and, with a surprising gentleness, wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "There is not a soul in this town, in this whole territory, that is clean. Every man and woman out here is running from something, or hiding something, or has a darkness inside them they are afraid to look at. Me most of all. His confession hung in the air between them. Me most of all. He was not offering her pity. He was offering her kinship. He was telling her that they were the same, that her scars had a home next to his. The raw honesty of it silenced her tears. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the hard, weathered exterior to the profound sorrow he carried within him. In that moment, something shifted. The air grew thick, charged with all the things they had never said, with all the lonely nights and shared struggles. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. She watched him come closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. He touched his lips to hers. The kiss was hesitant, trembling, born of a desperate need for a single moment of solace in a world that offered none. It was as tender as it was sorrowful. It tasted of salt from her tears and the dust of the trail. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was the meeting of two broken souls, finding a fragile shelter in each other. That night, the cabin was different. The space between them was no longer a chasm, but a trembling, electrified field. They ate their meal in near silence, but it was a silence filled with the echo of that kiss. After they had cleaned up, he built up the fire. He turned to look at her where she stood by the cot, her arms wrapped around herself. The question was in his eyes, unspoken but clear. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He crossed the room and stood before her. He raised his hand and gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the faint, yellowing edge of the bruise that was finally starting to fade. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. He lowered his head and kissed her again, more deeply this time. A slow, searching kiss that spoke of loneliness and longing. He led her to the cot and they sat, their hands finding each other in the dim light. His touch was tentative, questioning. He unbuttoned the top button of her dress, his fingers clumsy. He was mapping a new territory, one far more dangerous than the open plains. As he slid the dress from her shoulders, his hand brushed against her skin, his touch instinctively possessive, the touch of a man claiming a woman. She flinched. It was a small, involuntary recoil, a ghost of memory rising up from her battered past. Her body remembered rough hands and pain, and it reacted before her mind could. Cole froze, pulling his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. The self-loathing returned, swift and brutal. "Clara," he began, his voice hoarse with shame. "I am sorry. No," she whispered, her eyes opening, locking with his. They were filled with tears, but also with a fierce, desperate strength he had never seen before. She reached out and took his hand, placing it back on her bare shoulder. Her skin was cold. "Please," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Continue." It was the bravest thing he had ever heard. She was not just giving him permission. She was fighting for this moment. For herself. She was choosing to trust him, even when her own body screamed at her not to. A wave of profound tenderness washed over him, eclipsing everything else. He understood. This was not about desire, not in the simple way other men understood it. This was about healing. It was a test to see if a man's touch could be something other than a weapon, a test to see if the world could still be gentle to them. Their lovemaking was a quiet, solemn exploration. It was filled with a strange and beautiful mix of pain and tenderness. Every touch was both a question and an answer. He was impossibly gentle, his movements slow and deliberate, watching her face in the firelight for any sign of fear. And she was a study in contradictions, her body still holding the memory of trauma, yet her spirit reaching for him, arching into his touch, seeking a connection she had been starved of for so long. It was as if they were two wounded animals, cautiously learning to trust again. Their scars and bruises a testament to the battles they had survived. Their tentative embrace a prayer for a peace they were not sure they deserved. The morning arrived not with a gentle dawn, but with a harsh, unforgiving light that seemed to strip everything down to its barest truth. The tender intimacy of the night dissolved like a dream, leaving behind a cold and awkward reality. The small cabin, which had briefly felt like a sanctuary, now seemed cramped and suffocating, each floorboard creaking with unspoken accusations. Clara awoke first, her body stiff and sore in a way that had nothing to do with the hard work of the previous days. A wave of shame, so potent it was nauseating, washed over her. The cruel words of the townswomen echoed in her head. Tainted goods. Last night, she had not been a survivor finding solace. She had been a fallen woman, confirming their every judgment. She had invited this man's touch, had taken comfort in his arms, and in doing so, had surely invited her own punishment. It was the grim lesson Edwin had taught her. Any moment of softness, any hint of pleasure, was a sin that would be paid for in pain. She slipped out of the cot, dressing quietly in the half-light, her movements furtive and small. She could not bring herself to look at Cole, who slept in the chair by the cold hearth. She felt as though her sin was written across her face for him to see. When Cole awoke, the fire was already lit and coffee was boiling, but the familiar, quiet comfort of their morning routine was gone. Clara moved about the cabin with her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. She did not speak, and when he tried to thank her for the coffee, she merely nodded, her face averted. He felt a different kind of poison twisting in his own gut. Guilt. The image of her face in the firelight, vulnerable and trusting, haunted him. He had taken advantage of her. He had seen her brokenness, her desperation for a moment of peace, and he had used it to satisfy his own loneliness. He was no better than the leering men in the saloon. He had taken what was not his to take, not with force, but with a calculated gentleness that felt even more predatory in the morning light. He had seen the ghost of Sarah in her eyes, had told himself he was protecting her, but he had ended up betraying them both. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing minute, a thick, suffocating blanket of shame and regret. He ate the breakfast she prepared without tasting it, the food turning to ash in his mouth. Their fragile peace was shattered late that morning by the sound of an approaching horse. Cole was instantly on his feet, his hand going to the pistol tucked into his belt. He moved to the window, peering out cautiously. It was Sheriff Miller, riding alone, his horse moving at a lazy amble. Clara shrank back into the corner of the cabin, her face draining of all color. "He knows," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He has come for me." "Stay back from the window," Cole ordered, his voice a low growl. He stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him, positioning himself as a physical barrier between the law and the woman inside. He stood on the porch, his arms crossed, his face a hard, unreadable mask as the sheriff reined in. "Mercer," Sheriff Miller said, not bothering to dismount. He shifted his considerable weight in the saddle. "Came out to give you a final warning. Your trouble has officially arrived." Cole said nothing, his gray eyes fixed on the lawman. "Edwin Duval rode into town an hour ago," the sheriff continued, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the porch steps. "He's not a patient man. He's been in the saloon, flashing money, buying drinks, and telling anyone who'll listen how his wife was stolen from him by a reclusive rancher. He's got 2 men with him, hired guns by the look of them. Hard cases." A cold dread settled in Cole's stomach, but his expression did not change. The sheriff leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Now, I told him I'd handle it. I'm giving you the chance to do this the easy way. You turn the woman over to him, and he'll ride out. No fuss, no bloodshed. He says he won't press any charges against you for keeping her." The sheriff's lips curled into a faint, knowing smirk. "She is not a stray cow to be turned over," Cole said, his voice dangerously quiet. Sheriff Miller sighed, a theatrical display of exasperation. "Listen to me, Mercer. I do not care about your feelings on the matter. The law is the law. That woman is his legal wife. He has papers to prove it. That makes her his property. A man has got the right to take back what is his, and I will not stand in his way. I am telling you this as a courtesy. If he and his men ride out here to collect her, I will not be intervening. Whatever happens on your land will be a private matter." The message was chillingly clear. The law was washing its hands of them. They were on their own. "You have until sundown, Mercer," the sheriff said, gathering his reins. "After that, you are on your own. I would think long and hard about whether she is worth dying for," with a final, dismissive nod. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Cole stood on the porch for a long time after the sheriff was gone, staring at the empty trail. He felt the familiar, cold grip of failure closing around his heart. He had brought this on her. His foolish attempt at kindness had led her right into a dead end. He went back inside. Clara was standing exactly where he had left her, her face ashen. She had heard everything. "I have to leave," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "Right now. If I am gone, he will have no reason to trouble you." She started toward the door, her movements jerky and panicked. "No," Cole said, stepping in front of her, blocking her path. "You do not understand," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "He will destroy you just for spite. He will burn this place to the ground and you with it. I have brought this ruin to your door. I cannot let you pay for my mistakes." She tried to push past him, but he was an immovable wall of muscle and resolve. "And where will you go?" he demanded, his voice rough. "Back to him, or will you run until you collapse in the dust again? There is nowhere for you to go. Clara, he will hunt you down." "It does not matter," she sobbed, her fists beating uselessly against his chest. "It is better than seeing you hurt because of me. I will not have another man's blood on my hands." He grabbed her wrists, his grip firm but not painful. Forcing her to be still, he looked down into her tear-filled eyes, and for a moment, he did not see her. He saw Sarah. He saw the smoke and the flames, heard the echoes of screams he had been too late to answer. He saw the accusing face of his own failure, a ghost that had haunted his every waking moment for 5 long years. He had run away and hidden himself out here, punishing himself with solitude. But the guilt had followed him. It was a part of him. Now, it was happening again. A woman under his roof, in his care, was being threatened by violent men, and the world was turning a blind eye. "I could not save her," he said, his voice raw with a pain that was 5 years old. He was not talking to Clara anymore. He was talking to the ghost. "I was not there. I failed her." He looked back at Clara, his eyes burning with a fierce, terrible intensity. "I will not fail again. Do you understand me? I will not fail again." His vow was absolute, a sacred oath sworn in the crucible of his past. It had nothing to do with love or desire, and everything to do with a redemption he feared he could never achieve. Clara stopped struggling, silenced by the raw agony in his voice. She saw that this was no longer just about her. Her fate had become entangled with his past, with a wound so deep it had defined the man he was. "We will not wait for sundown," he said, his voice hard and decisive as he released her. "We will ride out now. We will head north, into the territories. We can lose them in the Badlands." The decision was made. A frantic energy filled the small cabin. There was no time for careful planning. They moved with a desperate haste, driven by the knowledge that the clock was ticking. Clara packed what little she had, the worn dress she had arrived in, a few provisions she gathered from the shelves. Cole went to the wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He pulled out a heavy Colt revolver, a twin to the one on his hip, and a box of cartridges. He checked the action, his movements swift and sure. He pushed the second pistol and a handful of ammunition toward her. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. She stared at the gun, her eyes wide. She shook her head. "Then you learn now." His voice was grim. He showed her how to hold it, how to aim, how to pull the trigger. Her hands trembled as she held the cold, heavy steel. It felt like an instrument of death, a final, terrible admission that there was no peaceful way out of this. He slung a rifle into a saddle scabbard and filled his pockets with extra shells. They were preparing not for a journey, but for a war. He grabbed a canvas sack and filled it with jerky, hardtack, and 2 canteens of water. Everything they were, everything they owned, was reduced to what they could carry on their horses. As Cole stepped outside to saddle Rusty and the mare, his body went rigid. He raised a hand, signaling for Clara to stay inside. He had seen movement at the top of the ridge that marked the only trail leading away from the ranch. 2 riders, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sky. They were not moving. They were just watching, waiting. They were trapped. Edwin's men had already blocked the trail. There was no escape. Cole backed into the cabin, his face a grim mask. "They are here," he said, his voice low. "They've cut off the trail." Clara's breath hitched in her throat. The last, flickering ember of hope was extinguished. She looked around the small cabin, the place that had been her prison, then her sanctuary. Now it was to be their tomb. They did not have to wait long. 3 riders appeared, coming not from the trail, but across the open plain. They rode slowly, deliberately, an invading army confident of its victory. The man in the lead was Edwin Duval. He was handsome, in a cruel, sharp-featured way, dressed in expensive Eastern clothes that looked absurdly out of place in the dusty landscape. A thin, predatory smile played on his lips. The 2 men flanking him were the opposite, rough, unshaven, with dead eyes that promised violence for pay. They reined in about 50 yards from the cabin. "Clara, my dear," Edwin called out, his voice smooth and cultured, yet carrying an unmistakable menace. "Your little holiday in the wilderness is over. I have come to take you home." Cole stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. Clara watched from the crack in the door, her heart pounding against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. "She is not going with you, Duval," Cole said, his voice calm and steady, a rock against which Edwin's oily charm broke. Edwin's smile tightened. "I believe that is for my wife to decide, but since you seem to have appointed yourself her guardian, perhaps I should address you. I am a reasonable man. You have enjoyed my property for some time now. I am willing to overlook your transgression if you simply step aside." "She is not your property." Edwin laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The law says otherwise, as does God. Now, I will ask you one last time. Stand aside." "Get off my land," Cole said. That was the end of the negotiations. Edwin gave a curt nod to his men. They dismounted, pulling rifles from their saddle scabbards, and began to advance on the cabin, spreading out to flank it. Edwin remained on his horse, a king directing his soldiers. The world seemed to explode in a hail of gunfire. The hired men were professionals. They fired not at Cole, but at the cabin, splintering the doorframe, shattering the single window. Clara screamed, diving to the floor as glass rained down. Cole fired back from the cover of the porch, the crack of his rifle sharp and loud. He was not aiming to kill, but to drive them back, to show them this would not be easy. One of the men let out a yell as a bullet tore through the fleshy part of his arm. The other man used the distraction to charge the side of the cabin, seeking a blind spot. Cole knew he was caught. He could not fight them both from the porch. "Clara, the window!" he yelled. "Keep the other one back." Clara, trembling on the floor, looked at the pistol Cole had given her. Her hands were slick with sweat. She crawled to the shattered window, the broken glass crunching beneath her. She saw the second man trying to circle around toward the back, without thinking, fueled by pure, desperate terror. She raised the heavy gun, closed her eyes, and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening inside the small cabin. The recoil slammed her arm back. She did not know if she had hit anything, but the man yelled a curse and scrambled back behind the water trough, pinned down. The first man, clutching his bleeding arm, saw his chance. With Cole's attention divided, he rushed the porch. He was big and heavy, and he slammed into Cole like a runaway bull. The rifle went flying. The two men crashed to the wooden planks of the porch, a tangle of limbs and grunts and curses. Cole was strong, his muscles hardened by years of labor, but the other man was a brawler. He landed a heavy fist on Cole's jaw, and for a second, the world went gray. The man scrambled on top of him, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. His face was contorted in a mask of rage and pain. "I will gut you for that, rancher," he snarled, raising the knife. Clara saw it all from the window. She screamed Cole's name. The scream seemed to clear Cole's head. Adrenaline surged through him. As the knife came down, he twisted, deflecting the blow. The blade sank deep into the wooden porch next to his head, before the man could pull it free. Cole drove his knee hard into his groin. The man gasped, his body arching in pain. It was the opening Cole needed. He shoved the man off him, scrambled for his fallen pistol, and rolled to his feet. The hired man, recovering, charged again, this time heedless of any weapon, intent on finishing the fight with his bare hands. He was a snarling, hulking shape of pure violence. Cole raised the pistol. There was no time to aim, no time to think. There was only the man's furious face, the glint of the knife still in his hand, and Clara's terrified scream echoing in his ears. He fired. The shot was a flat, ugly sound that seemed to suck all the other noise from the world. The big man stopped, a look of profound surprise on his face. A dark, wet stain blossomed on his chest. He staggered backward a step. Then his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the dusty ground, a lifeless heap. An unnerving silence fell. The second gunman, seeing his partner fall, lost his nerve. He fired one last wild shot toward the cabin and then ran for his horse. Scrambling into the saddle and fleeing across the plains, Edwin Duval, who had watched the entire brutal exchange from a safe distance, stared at the dead body of his hired man, his handsome face pale with shock and fury. The silence was broken by the sound of approaching horses. It was the sheriff and a posse of 3 men. They had been waiting, just out of sight, ready to ride in once the dirty work was done. Sheriff Miller took in the scene at a glance. The dead man on the ground. Cole standing on the porch with a smoking pistol in his hand, the shattered window of the cabin. His face settled into a mask of grim authority. "Drop the gun, Mercer," the sheriff said, his voice cold and final. Cole let the pistol fall from his numb fingers. It hit the porch with a hollow thud. Edwin Duval finally found his voice. "He murdered my man! Sheriff!" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Cole. "I saw it all! He shot him down in cold blood!" 2 of the posse members dismounted and grabbed Cole's arms, wrenching them behind his back with practiced roughness. They tied his wrists with a leather thong. Clara ran out of the cabin, her face a mess of tears and gunpowder smudges. "No!" she screamed. "It was not like that. He was defending himself. He was defending me." The sheriff ignored her. He looked at Edwin. "Is this your wife?" "It is," Edwin said, a triumphant, possessive gleam in his eyes. He dismounted and walked toward Clara, his stride confident again. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "She is a bit hysterical. The ordeal has been too much for her." "No, let me go!" Clara shrieked, struggling against his grip, trying to get to Cole. "Cole! Take him to town," the sheriff ordered his men. "Lock him up. The charge is murder." They began to drag Cole toward a horse. He did not resist. His face was numb, his eyes locked on Clara. He had failed. He had not saved her. He had only managed to damn himself. Edwin tightened his grip on Clara's arm, pulling her close. "It is over, my dear," he whispered into her ear. his breath hot and foul. "You are coming home." "Cole!" Clara screamed, her voice a raw, animal cry of pure agony as she watched the posse drag him away. "Cole!" He looked over his shoulder one last time, his face a mask of defeat and despair, before he was forced onto a horse and led away, a prisoner destined for the gallows. The town jail was a squat stone box with a single, barred window that faced the dusty main street. It smelled of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and despair. For Cole, it was not so different from the cabin he had built for himself. Both were prisons, one made of stone and iron, the other of guilt and memory. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his hands resting on his knees, and listened to the town pass judgment on him. Through the window, he heard the rhythms of life and the whispers of his own condemnation. He heard the rumble of wagon wheels, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, and the shrill laughter of children. And woven through it all were the voices, dissecting his life, twisting his story into a shape that satisfied their hunger for simple villains and clear-cut justice. "Always knew there was something off about him," he heard a man say, his voice carrying from the saloon porch across the street. "That quiet type. They are the ones you have to watch. Still waters run deep and black." "He seduced her, that is what I heard," another voice added. "Poor woman, running from a troubled marriage, and he preyed on her weakness, a wolf in sheep's clothing." The women's voices gathered near the mercantile were even more cutting, their words laced with a vicious piety. "She led him on, of course, a woman like that, no morals, but he is the one who pulled the trigger, a murderer and a seducer. The devil gets them both in the end." Cole listened without anger. The lies did not matter. The truth was that a man was dead by his hand, and Clara was gone. Delivered back to the monster she had fled, he had failed. The verdict of the town was nothing compared to the verdict he had already passed on himself. The circuit judge was due in 2 weeks, but it was a formality. In a place like this, a man's guilt was decided in the saloon, not the courtroom. A swift trial and a short rope were all he had to look forward to, in a strange, dark corner of his soul. He welcomed it. It felt like justice, not for the man he had killed, but for the woman he had let die 5 years ago. This, then, was his penance. While Cole sat with his ghosts in a stone cell, Clara was confined in a prison of lace and mahogany. Edwin had not taken her back to their home, but had rented the finest house in town, the one belonging to the banker who was away on business. It was his way of showing the town his wealth and status, of reinforcing the narrative that he was the wronged gentleman, come to rescue his wayward wife. The house was beautiful, filled with polished wood, velvet curtains, and delicate china she was terrified to touch. But the windows were always watched by one of the new men Edwin had hired, and the doors were always locked. Her new jailers were silent and watchful, their presence a constant reminder that she was a possession, a piece of property to be guarded. Edwin was a master of public perception. In town, he was the picture of a concerned, heartbroken husband. He spoke in hushed, sorrowful tones of his wife's fragile nerves, of the regrettable influence the rough rancher had exerted over her. He paid for rounds of drinks at the saloon, his generosity cementing the town's sympathy. But inside the locked house, the mask came off. He would sit across from her at the polished dining table, a cruel, triumphant smile on his lips. "You see, my dear," he would say, his voice a soft poison, "this is where you belong, not in some filthy cabin with a grubby murderer. You are Mrs. Edwin Duval, and you will not forget it again." Her spirit, which had begun to heal under the vast, quiet sky of Cole's ranch, was now breaking. The hope that had flickered to life was being systematically smothered under the weight of Edwin's control. He did not need to hit her. His victory was so complete that his mere presence was enough to suffocate her. She grew quiet and still, moving through the beautiful rooms like a ghost, her eyes vacant. The world outside the windows a hazy, distant dream. She was retreating inside herself, to the one place he could not touch, but it was a cold and empty place to live. The thought of Cole, sitting in that stone jail, waiting to die for her, was the one thing that could still pierce through the numbness. It was a shard of glass in her heart, twisting with every breath. He had tried to protect her, and his reward was a noose. Her ruin, as the women in the store had predicted, was complete. She had destroyed him. One night, as a sliver of moon cast a pale light through her bedroom window, a desperate, final act of defiance took root in her broken spirit. She could not save herself, but she had to try to save him. She had to make the truth known. She found a loose page in a book of poetry on the nightstand and a small charcoal pencil meant for sketching. By the faint moonlight, her hands trembling, she began to write. She wrote to Sheriff Miller, her words a torrent of confession and pleading. She told him everything, starting from the first day of her marriage to Edwin. She wrote of the beatings, of the accusations, of being locked in the dark, of the fear that was her constant companion. She described her escape, her collapse on the trail, and the quiet, unexpected kindness of the man who had found her. She detailed the events of the final confrontation, explaining that Cole had only fired his weapon to save his own life from a man who was about to kill him with a knife. "He is not a murderer," she wrote, the charcoal smudging under the pressure of her fingers. "He is a good man who showed mercy to a stranger. I am the one who brought this trouble. If there is a crime, it is mine. Please, I beg you, do not let an innocent man hang for my sins. Let me testify. Let the truth be heard." Folding the letter into a small, tight square was the easy part. Getting it to the sheriff was another matter. Her only hope was the neighbor woman, a widow named Martha, who sometimes came to the back door to sell eggs and milk from her small farm. Martha was a quiet woman with kind, sad eyes, one of the few people in town who had ever looked at Clara with compassion instead of judgment. The next morning, when Martha arrived, Clara managed a moment alone with her in the kitchen while her guard was distracted. With trembling hands, she pressed the folded paper into the older woman's palm. "Please," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "This is for the sheriff. It is a man's life. Please." Martha looked from the desperate letter to Clara's face, at the fresh, faint bruise coloring her cheek where Edwin's signet ring had caught her the day before. A look of profound understanding and sorrow passed over the widow's features. She nodded once, slipping the note into her apron pocket. "God be with you, child," she whispered, and then she was gone. For 2 days, Clara lived on a knife's edge of hope and terror. Every time she heard footsteps on the street, she prayed it was the sheriff, coming to set things right, but the sheriff never came. On the evening of the second day, Edwin entered her room. He was holding the letter in his hand. He must have intercepted Martha, threatened her, or bribed her. The how did not matter. He had it. The last of her hope turned to ice in her veins. "I must admit, my dear," he said, his voice dangerously soft as he unfolded the paper. "It is quite a work of fiction, seductive, tragic. You have a flair for the dramatic." He read a line aloud, mocking her words. "He is a good man who showed mercy to a stranger." How very touching. He walked to the fireplace, where a low fire burned against the evening chill. "The truth, Clara," he said, holding the letter over the flames, "is whatever I say it is. And I say you are a liar and an adulteress, and that Cole Mercer is a killer who will get what he deserves." He let the paper drop. It curled, blackened, and was consumed by the fire, her desperate words turning to weightless gray ash. She watched her last chance burn. A strangled sob caught in her throat. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble," he continued, turning from the fire to face her. His eyes were cold and flat. "And for that, you require a lesson, a final reminder of your place." He crossed the room in 2 strides. What followed was a blur of pain and darkness, a final, brutal erasure of the woman who had dared to fight back. He was not just punishing her body. He was trying to kill the last remnants of her soul. When he was done, he locked the door, leaving her in a broken heap on the expensive rug, the faint smell of smoke and ash hanging in the air. She lay there for a long time, drifting in a fog of pain. But through the fog, a single, clear thought pierced through. The circuit judge was arriving tomorrow. The trial would be swift. They would hang Cole in the morning. Edwin had not killed her spirit. He had burned away everything but the one thing that now mattered. Not her life, his. Sometime after midnight, she heard a faint scratching at her window. She dragged her aching body across the floor and pulled back the curtain. It was Martha, her face a pale oval in the darkness. There was no pity in her eyes now, only a grim resolve. The widow had been a victim once, too. She had seen Edwin's true face when he had taken the letter from her, and it had awakened an old, fierce anger. "He is a devil," Martha whispered through the glass, "and this town will let him get away with it. The back door is unbolted. The guard is asleep in the kitchen. If you are going to run, child, you run now." It was not a choice. It was a necessity, fueled by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline. Clara forced the window open. Martha helped her down, and together they crept through the shadows of the banker's garden. Two ghosts moving through a sleeping town. Martha pointed her toward the main square. "Godspeed," she whispered, before melting back into the darkness. Clara did not look back. She ran, her bare feet silent on the cool dirt of the street, her only thought to get to the jail, to get to Cole, before it was too late. The sun was just rising when she reached the square, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and gray. But there was no softness in the scene before her. A crowd had already gathered, a raw timber gallows, hastily constructed, stood in the center of the square like a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. The circuit judge, eager to be on his way, had held his trial at dawn. The verdict had been swift, the sentence immediate. She saw the door of the jail open. First the sheriff emerged, then two deputies, and then Cole. His hands were tied behind his back. He was pale, but his head was held high, his steps steady as they led him toward the gallows. He was not fighting. He was accepting it. A wave of nausea and terror washed over Clara. "No," she breathed, the word had lost in the murmur of the crowd. She began to push her way forward, shoving past men and women who had come to watch a man die. They grumbled and cursed at her until they saw her face. The sight of her, her dress torn, her lips split open, a fresh, dark bruise purpling her eye, sent a ripple of shock and confusion through the crowd. This was not the seductive adulteress from the rumors. This was a brutalized victim. Cole saw her then. As he reached the foot of the gallows, he saw her fighting her way through the crowd, and his stoic calm shattered. A look of pure anguish crossed his face. "Clara, no," he muttered under his breath. "Get away from here." She broke through the last line of onlookers and threw herself into the space between Cole and the gallows. Collapsing at Sheriff Miller's feet, she grabbed the hem of his trousers, her voice a raw, ragged cry that tore through the morning stillness. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You cannot do this! You are hanging an innocent man!" The sheriff, startled, took a step back. "What is the meaning of this? Mrs. Duval? The trial is over." "The trial was a lie!" she shrieked, forcing herself to her knees. She pointed a trembling finger at her own battered face. "Look at me! Look at what my husband did to me because I wrote you a letter! A letter telling you the truth! He burned it! He beat me so I would stay silent! But I will not be silent anymore!" The crowd was utterly still now, their morbid curiosity replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. They saw her injuries. They heard the desperate conviction in her voice. And the simple story they had all agreed upon began to crumble. "He killed my man in cold blood," a voice snarled from the edge of the crowd. Edwin Duval pushed his way forward, his handsome face a mask of fury. His control had finally snapped. He had seen her escape and had followed, but he was too late. His lies were unraveling in front of the entire town.
"She is a hysterical liar,"
Edwin shouted, his eyes wild. He pulled a small, silver derringer from his coat pocket.
"She belongs to me, and I will not let her ruin me."
He aimed the pistol, not at Cole, but at Clara. She was the source of all his problems, the possession that had defied him. If he could not have her, no one would. Everything happened in a heartbeat. The sheriff was frozen in indecision. The crowd gasped. Cole, seeing the gun pointed at Clara, reacted with pure, primal instinct. With a roar of fury that came from the depths of his soul, he lunged forward. Despite his bound hands, he threw his body in front of hers, a human shield. The derringer fired with a sharp crack. Cole cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. As the bullet slammed into his side, he staggered, his momentum carrying him forward into Clara. They both collapsed into the dust at the foot of the gallows. Edwin stood for a moment, the smoking pistol in his hand, his face a picture of disbelief. He had shot the wrong person. The entire town was now staring at him, their faces a mixture of horror and dawning fury. The whispers of murderer were now directed at him. His gamble had failed spectacularly. Panicked, he turned and fled, shoving people aside as he ran for his horse. The spell of inaction was broken.
"Get him!"
Someone in the crowd roared. The sheriff, his face red with shame and anger at having been so thoroughly duped, drew his own revolver.
"Do not let him get away,"
he bellowed. A dozen men, their own guilt and complicity fueling their rage, joined the chase. The posse that had been formed to capture Cole now thundered after the real villain. The crowd surged after them, leaving a sudden, quiet emptiness in the center of the square. Clara was on her knees in the dust, cradling Cole's head in her lap. He was bleeding, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. His face was pale, his breathing shallow.
"Cole,"
she sobbed, her tears falling onto his face.
"Oh, Cole."
His eyes fluttered open. He looked up at her, a faint, sad smile touching his lips.
"I told you,"
he whispered, his voice a faint rasp. "I would not fail again." He coughed, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. Maybe this is the punishment I deserved all along."
"No,"
she begged, her voice thick with tears as she pressed her hand against the wound, a futile attempt to stop the life that was pouring out of him.
"Do not say that. Do not leave me. Please, Cole. You have to hold on. Please, hold on."
The weeks that followed were a quiet, desperate battle waged within the four walls of the small cabin. The town doctor, a grim man named Elias Croft, who had seen more than his share of gunshot wounds, had come out to the ranch on the sheriff's reluctant orders. He had dug the bullet from Cole's side, stitched the wound with coarse thread, and left a bottle of laudanum with a shrug, offering no promises.
"He is strong,"
was all he said to Clara, his eyes holding a mixture of pity and suspicion.
"But the fever will decide."
The fever came, as predicted, a raging inferno that threatened to consume what was left of him. For days and nights that blurred into one another, Cole was lost to a world of delirium. He thrashed in the narrow cot, his body slick with sweat, his voice a low, tormented rasp. He called out names Clara did not know, shouted warnings into the empty air, and fought battles from a past she could only guess at. He called for Sarah, his voice thick with an agony so profound it made Clara's own heart ache in sympathy. She became his anchor in that storm. She was a constant, tireless presence at his side. She bathed his burning skin with cool water, forced spoonfuls of thin broth between his chapped lips, and held his hand when the tremors shook his powerful frame. She listened to his fevered confessions, piecing together the tragedy of the woman he had loved and failed to save. In his weakness, in his unguarded delirium, she saw the raw, gaping wound at the center of his soul, the source of the quiet pain that had defined him
and she did not turn away. She stayed, her small, steady hands a constant reassurance in his darkness. Slowly, miraculously, the fever broke. One morning, she awoke in the chair beside his cot to find him watching her. His eyes clear for the first time in over a week. They were sunken in his pale, gaunt face, but they were his own. The storm had passed. His recovery was a slow and arduous journey back to the world. The pain was a constant, sharp presence, and his weakness was a frustration that chafed at his pride. But Clara's care never wavered. She changed his bandages with gentle, practiced hands, her touch no longer hesitant but sure and comforting. She helped him sit up, then to stand, her small frame a sturdy support for his weakened one. The awkwardness and shame that had existed between them before the shooting had been burned away in the crucible of his fever. They had been stripped down to their most essential selves, a man in need and a woman who had discovered a deep, fierce well of strength she never knew she possessed. In the long, quiet evenings, as he sat propped up with pillows by the fire, they began to talk. The words came haltingly at first, fragile bridges built across the chasm of their shared trauma. He told her about Sarah, about the ranch they were supposed to build together, about the guilt he carried like a shroud. He spoke of his failure not as an excuse, but as a simple, damning fact that had shaped every day of his life since. In turn, she spoke of her life with Edwin, not of the beatings, but of the slower, more insidious violence, the erosion of her spirit, the theft of her voice, the way he had made her feel that she was nothing without him. She talked about the shame, the loneliness, and the tiny, stubborn spark of defiance that had finally driven her to run. They were two survivors, comparing their scars in the soft glow of the firelight, and in the telling, in the quiet, shared act of bearing witness to each other's pain. A new kind of healing began. "We could leave," she said softly one night, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "When you are strong enough." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Leave? Go where?" "I do not know," she admitted. "Somewhere, green. Somewhere with trees and enough water in the rivers. Oregon, maybe. A place where no one knows our names. Where we could just be people. Not a murderer and the woman he ruined." The words hung in the air. A fragile, impossible dream. To start over. To wash the dust and blood of this place from their souls. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Maybe," he said, the word a quiet promise. The town had, for the most part, left them alone. The posse had caught Edwin Duval less than 10 miles from town, his horse having gone lame, faced with the testimony of the entire town and the damning evidence of Clara's injuries. His money and influence were worthless. The circuit judge, in a rare fit of righteous anger, had sentenced him to 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. The news brought Clara no joy, only a quiet, weary relief, the feeling of a great and terrible weight being lifted from her shoulders. Cole was a free man, his name cleared, but the town's verdict on them remained complicated and fickle. One morning, nearly a month after the shooting, Clara awoke to an empty cabin. A moment of panic seized her before she saw the door was ajar. She pulled on a shawl and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. She saw him down by the corral. He was standing, stripped to the waist despite the chill, his back to her. The wound in his side was a puckered, angry red scar, but his shoulders were straight and strong. He was holding a post-hole digger, and with a slow, deliberate rhythm, he was rebuilding the section of fence the storm had destroyed so long ago. She watched him for a long time, her heart swelling with a feeling so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He was not just rebuilding a fence. He was reclaiming his life, his strength, his purpose. He was the man she had first met, hard and capable. But the haunted look was gone from his eyes. He turned, sensing her presence, and a slow smile spread across his face. It was a real smile, one that reached his pale gray eyes. and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. From that day on, their life fell into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet purpose. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their silences comfortable and full of unspoken understanding. They shared coffee on the porch as the sun rose, the vast, empty plains stretching out before them not as a threat, but as a promise of solitude and freedom. They rode out together to check on the cattle, their horses ambling side by side, their shoulders sometimes brushing. These small, simple moments of peace were a balm on their scarred souls, more precious than gold. The last of the winter chill finally bled from the air, and the land began to stir. Spring arrived, not with a sudden burst, but with a subtle, hesitant greening of the hills. Tiny, vibrant wildflowers began to push their way through the hard-packed earth, splashes of purple and yellow against the dun-colored landscape. After so much death and hardship, the sight of this new life felt like a miracle, a sign from God that even the harshest ground could bloom again. One afternoon, Cole came out of the cabin carrying a shovel. In his other hand, he held the Colt revolver he had used to kill Edwin's man. He said nothing, but Clara understood. She followed him to a small, secluded spot near the creek, under the shade of a lone, resilient cottonwood tree. He dug a deep hole in the soft, damp earth. He looked at the gun for a long moment, his face a mixture of regret and resolve, before placing it gently in the bottom of the hole. It was not a trophy to be kept, or a demon to be feared. It was simply a part of their story that needed to be put to rest. He filled the hole, tamping the earth down with his boots. Clara knelt and began to place the wildflowers she had gathered on the small mound of fresh dirt. It was a grave, but also a garden. They were burying the violence, the fear, and the blood. And in its place, they were planting a marker of life, beauty, and peace. The whispers in town did not die completely. When they rode in for supplies, they still felt the stares. Some still saw Clara as a curse, a woman who brought trouble wherever she went. Others looked at Cole as a fool, a man who had nearly died for a woman who was not his. But the voices no longer had the power to wound them. Their world was no longer defined by the judgments of others, but by the quiet, unshakable truth they had found in each other. They had faced down death and shame and had walked out of the fire together. The gossip of small-minded people was nothing but ash on the wind. On a soft evening in late spring, they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and gold. A gentle breeze rustled the new leaves on the cottonwood tree. The world was quiet, peaceful. Clara turned to him, her face serious in the fading light. The question she had been holding in her heart for weeks finally found its voice. It was the last ghost to be faced, the final stone to be turned. "You will hurt me again, won't you?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. There was no fear in her question, no echo of the terror that had once defined her. It was a statement of fact, a question of profound and absolute trust. She was looking at the darkness she had once seen in him, the controlled violence, the raw, untamed power that had both frightened and protected her. She was not asking him to deny it. She was asking him to own it, to share it with her, to promise that it would be a part of their love, not a weapon against her. Cole looked at her, his gray eyes deep and serious. He understood the question she was truly asking. He knew she was not talking about the cruelty of men like Edwin, but about the fierce, consuming intensity that bound them together. Their love was not a gentle, polite thing. It was forged in pain, tempered by fire, and it would always carry the echo of the storm that had brought them together. He reached out, his calloused hand cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a tenderness that still made her breath catch. "Only the way you need," he answered, his voice a low, solemn vow. It was a promise of control, of protection, of a shared power that would never again be used to dominate or destroy. It was the answer her soul needed to hear. She leaned into his touch, a single, grateful tear tracing a path down her cheek. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the last sliver of the sun disappeared, leaving the sky to the stars. The wind began to rise, a familiar, restless sound sweeping across the plains. It picked up the fine, dry dust of the earth and mixed it with the soft, golden light of dusk, carrying them both together into the vast, darkening sky. It was a perfect reflection of what they had become. Two souls, one of pain and one of survival, forever bound together. Their love, both the wound that would always mark them and the only salvation they would ever truly know. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to connect with you. So please comment with where you are listening from. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.